Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the session today when I'm going to be talking about some ways you can defend your server against cyber attacks in a more of a real-time stance. And this is focused on IBM Power servers running IBM I. My name is Robin Tatam. I'm going to be your guide through the content today. I've been with HelpSystems now for well over a decade, and I would be happy to answer any security questions that you have. So please feel free to use me as a contact point for your security initiatives. My agenda today is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about the security events that can be logged by IBM I, also what can't be logged by IBM I, and where those things are stored and why you should be collecting them. We're also going to talk about how to turn some of that functionality on, so a kind of foundation for you in order to be able to perform this kind of detection and alerting. One of the challenges a lot of people run into is the deluge of data that can be logged. And so we're going to talk about ways that we can manage that. And we're also going to talk about a unique challenge that comes with IBM I. Of course, no session will be complete without us giving some introduction to a solution that you may use to help you deal with all of this. So security events can be logged from all types of devices and all types of equipment, ranging from system servers like Power servers, maybe Windows servers, Linux servers, as well as end-user devices like workstations. We also have the ability in many instances to be able to log events from network equipment, firewalls, software packages like antivirus, and a whole slew of other things. And some of these events are going to be pretty mundane, while others perhaps are indicative of an active threat. And when that active threat is occurring, it's very important that we have rapid response to that. Unfortunately, too many cyber incidences occur and are logged, but nobody actually notices that they're taking place. And so we want to resolve part of that issue. So one of the questions I often get asked is, why do I need to do this logging? Well, obviously, I think there's some level of just best practice saying you need to know what's happening on the equipment and the network in which your organization relies. But in many instances, we have industry regulations. The payment card industry, known as PCI, has mandates that say that you need to be monitoring for security activities or security-centric activities that may be happening in your environment. We also see many regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley for the organizations that are publicly traded in the US, to the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, HIPAA, which is another American regulation for healthcare information. These all require some level of ongoing security monitoring. Again, as I said before, best practices state that we should know what's happening on our machines and on our network. So activity tracking of our users is another important step. If you're using some type of high availability replication for your application data between a system and a backup system, then there's a very good chance that you're going to require some level of monitoring. Of course, the primary has to know when something happens in order to give an indication to the backup or the secondary system that it should also be applied there. And lastly, while it's not such a common use of security monitoring, as a developer back in my past, I know I used this information to help when I was debugging an app, especially if you're in the process of securing that application or setting up object level security in the IBM I. The benefit here is that the security monitoring function will tell you if a user has been denied access to something so that you can resolve that quickly. So before we get into the data itself, of course, we have to talk about establishing the foundation of activating that security collection in the first place. The operating system actually contains a custom resource. We call it the Security Audit Journal. You may have heard of QAudJourn or heard people speaking about that. And that's in essence the special type of object that is recorded for those events. Now, this Security Audit Journal doesn't come pre-configured in the operating system. It's up to you to actually create it before you can activate or start that auditing function. The events that are seen are recorded into this audit journal based on the configuration of other audit controls, based on a system, a user, or even an individual object. My recommendation is to consider actually having a profile designated with Audit Special Authority, that's a user profile attribute, to maintain the auditing controls. In fact, many regulations require the audit function to be distinct and separate from other security officer type functions. Now, the Audit Special Authority is encompassed and granted to any security officer on your system, so they can perform a dual role there. But if you do have a mandate that speaks to segregation or separation of duty between those roles, the IBM I operating system is well spaced to be able to do that. The good news in this is that when we look at most IBM I systems, we know that the vast majority of you are indeed currently using the Security Audit Journal. It has been created, it is collecting that information, and it's available to you to interrogate. The problem that we have when we get to this is that we find that there are several failings. Number one is that most people who are using the audit journal are never looking at that data. We're going to talk about obviously resolving that today. Some other common challenges are that sometimes the audit journal has been configured on the behalf of high availability. I mentioned that that was a common use of the security audit data just a moment ago. But if the HA function has turned the audit function on for you, it may not have turned it on with the optimal settings from a security person's perspective. The other challenge that we see often is that this data is purged too quickly. So we've got certainly some things to check to ensure that we're using this audit journal data appropriately, but we're going to start with activating it in the first place. One of the common recommendations that I give to people is that you may want to consider creating a library to contain the audit journal receivers. If you haven't had much exposure to audit journals and audit journal receivers, think of an audit journal as the funnel over a conveyor belt, and the receiver is the container that sits underneath it that actually receives the data. That's where the audit information is going to live. These things generally have a finite size, so when the receiver becomes full, the journal will pause the stream and it will move the receiver out of the way and move a fresh empty receiver in its place. These receivers contain all of the valuable information, and so having them in their own custom library is just a good way to keep them safe and secure. If you don't do this, the default location for this information is the QGPL library. QGPL stands for General Purpose Library and is arguably not a great place for security data to reside. The Security Audit Journal is often called QAudJourn because it has that distinct and static name. You can't change that, you can't decide on your own name. It also always resides in the QSys library. Now, if you're confused thinking, well, you just told me to put it somewhere else, remember, this is the funnel. This is the QAudJourn, as the journal is simply the director that sends that stream of information into the all-important receivers. In fact, the receivers can be called anything. They can have any naming convention, and they can reside in any library, including the one that I recommended you just create. It is absolutely possible to create the audit journal, the journal receivers, to put them in a library, and to set up the system values manually. But my recommendation is to use the proprietary command change security auditing in order to pull all of those moving parts and pieces together. With the exception of creating the custom library, this means that the auditing function can be activated through nothing more than a single command. This is what it looks like. There are three primary parameters here that we're going to talk about: the audit control system value, the auditing values, and the name and location of that initial journal receiver. Let's walk through each of these step by step. Number one, the audit control system value. As its name suggests, this is a system value, and it is belonging to the QAud control attribute. Now, this is in essence the on-off switch that activates the auditing function, and the operating system is pre-configured in the none state, meaning auditing is turned off. There are two other values that we recommend that you place into this system value. Star aud level is 1. That will turn on event auditing at a system level, all user auditing in essence. And then I also recommend that you turn on object auditing, which will enable auditing at an object level. This value does not automatically start auditing access to every object. That has to be done in conjunction with turning on the audit attribute on the object of interest. So in essence, by turning on object audit, we are just facilitating use of object auditing at some stage. There is a third option, no QTemp, that I've listed down at the bottom, that instructs the system to really not pay attention when activities are occurring in a job's temporary library. You may know this as the QTemp library. Arguably each job has one. It's a scratch pad, and the information there typically is not something that has to be audited. However, it's a very, very subtle noise filter. It's not going to make a major difference. And so just understand, regardless of these settings, once you have the audit level and the object audit activated, there is a possibility that you will audit a lot of information. We're going to talk about that in a second. The second parameter on that command was the auditing values, and this corresponds to actually two system values, the primary QAud level and an overflow called QAud level 2. The QAud level 2 was born after the combinations of different audit attributes would no longer fit into the QAud level system value. The purpose of this particular system value, or pair of system values, allows us as the administrator to designate what system level events should be audited. If you're not sure, then there is a special value of star default set. If you designate that option, it's going to translate into the following 5 values: authority failures, object creations, object deletions, security-centric events, and save restore activities. Although I should mention that it's really only restore activities. There was this name, it never really came to fruition, and the save activities will not be audited. The auditing values continued, as I said, is going to introduce QAud level 2 as well. And this was born as a reminder just simply because the original QAud level could no longer hold all of the possible combinations. The important thing to understand with QAud level 2 is that it is looked at or referenced only if the primary, the QAud level, includes the value telling it to do so, which is indicated by the star aud level 2. What I often see in IBM shops is that we see some values in QAud level and other values in QAud level 2, and we may even see overlapping attributes. So my suggestion is to keep this very simple, is in the QAud level, the initial one, just simply give the indicator that you want to defer all decision making over to the second one, the overflow. The benefit of this is that the overflow has many more slots, allowing you to designate any combination of those audit attributes without ever running out of space. So this way, we're arguably just telling the system to pretend QAud level doesn't really exist and to do everything through the more spacious QAud level 2. When we talk about system-wide auditing, we have numerous categories available at our disposal. These are listed here, also on the next slide, so it does overflow. 3 of these indicated when the font is in an italics that there are sub-values that can be specified if you don't want the parent and the full flow of the parent to be included. It's important to note that all of these options, with the exception of the first one in this list, can also be specified on a user-by-user basis. The purpose in doing this at a system level is to simplify the task if you want all of the activities from all users activated rather than have to go to each individual user one by one. So the attention event can't be done at a user level because it pertains to the system firewall function. If you're not familiar with the system firewall function, the intrusion detection, intrusion prevention system, certainly something to Google and take a look at. But in this instance, it is not a user-centric activity. A firewall typically is going to collect denial of service attacks and other types of non-specific user events, in which case you can't turn it on a user-by-user basis. However, everything else you absolutely can set on an individual user perspective. The list, as I said, continues onto this second slide. You're welcome to copy this down, but in essence, all of this is available in the help text for the QAud level and QAud level 2 system values. The third and final parameter on our change security auditing command is the initial journal receiver. Now I've got a big note in red up at the top that if you already have your auditing function active, then this parameter is ignored. So you can't come in after the fact and run another change sec audit and move your receivers into that library, that custom library we created at the beginning. So that takes a little bit of manual step that I've laid out at the bottom of the slide here. So the intent of this parameter, predominantly for people that are activating auditing for the first time, is to indicate the name of the journal receiver and the location of that receiver. Now again, a reminder, the journal receiver is what holds the actual audit data. Again, having it in its own library makes it easier for us to secure that content as well as have a simpler task if we ever need to restore it. My suggestion is to include a sequence number in the name of the initial receiver because the operating system, when it moves that conveyor belt and moves an empty receiver in place of the full one, is going to simply increment a number if it finds one there. So you could use a name like oddreceive0001, and when the operating system says, oh, that receiver is full, I need to give you a new one, it will automatically create and attach oddreceive0002. And so your life becomes a whole lot easier as it pertains to managing this data. If you are indeed already auditing, and as we've said, there's an 80% chance that you are, if you like my idea of having the audit receivers in their own distinct library, then there are a couple of steps that you have to follow. Namely, creating the library, of course, but then creating manually a new journal receiver in that library with the naming convention that I've laid out here. Then you will attach it to the QAudJourn, the actual journal itself. And from that point on, the operating system will take care of any subsequent receivers. So in essence, what we're doing is just forcing a changeover to a new receiver, with the new receiver being in our naming convention, in our new library, and the operating system will take care of everything else from that point on. I want to point out that there are two additional audit-related system values on your machine that you should be aware of. However, you likely won't change or override these attributes. The force level system value indicates how many audit records will be cached before they are flushed out to the disk. There's a good chance, if you're dealing with a regulatory mandate, that dictates that all records must be written to disk. If that's the case, you have the option of setting that to 0. Otherwise, the default value of *sys allows the operating system to decide when to flush that data out to the disk for performance optimization. And the other one is the auditing end action. This tells the operating system what should happen if the server, for some reason, is unable to perform that auditing task. The default value of *notify simply sends a message to the QSysOper message queue and QSysMessage, if you have one, telling it that the auditing function has been suspended. If you designate the stricter PowerDownSys option, as its name suggests, this forces the system to immediately go into a power down initiative. Now again, most shops are going to be satisfied with sending a message to QSysOper, especially if you have some type of messaging monitoring automation over your QSysOper queue, something like Robot or Halcyon that will bring that notification to your attention. If you're part of the CIA, then the PowerDownSys option most likely is your only choice because there is no scenario where they will not want a possibility of an action being audited. If you do choose that, then just be aware the system is going to go down, and after the system does complete its IPL or partially completes its IPL, a user that carries all object and audit special authorities must turn the auditing back on and then bring the system out of the final restricted state. So there is some intervention required at that point to resolve whatever issue caused the auditing to be suspended in the first place. For most of us, the notify option is just fine, and as stated, that is the default setting. Well, let's talk about the volume of data. One of the things that I hear often from people that have activated auditing is that when they turned it on, they felt that they were taking a drink from a fire hose. And that is actually a perfect analogy. Especially with IBM I, it's capable of logging a staggering amount of information. But the reality is that we can customize the type of events that are being recorded. If you turn it on and determine that your system is generating more events than can be reasonably processed, you've got two solutions. One is to utilize the ability to automate some of that functionality to assist you. Of course, you can also dial back the volume of data based on the type of events that you're recording. The one caveat or recommendation, I guess, that I have for you is don't just turn it off. If you find that the data is too much, you don't have to completely quiesce the whole process. Just dial it back down. On a computer, there can be millions of things that happen every day, and so it's hard to notice what's truly important amongst things that aren't. We may see critical problems such as a possible hardware failure, or even a cyber attack or data breach, and these could go unnoticed until it's a big old muddy mess. Looking for those events becomes like looking for that proverbial needle in an ever-changing haystack. It's time-consuming, very prone to human error, and certainly not a task that anybody would describe as fun. System logs can contain an incredible number of log entries. Automation, of course, can quickly analyze those log files and then bring to the forefront and highlight the entries that are deemed most important. Of course, this is the real world, and most people have more than just one server. Multiply that initial technology challenge by hundreds, possibly even thousands of servers and other devices, and you have a critically important task that no one wants or could arguably adequately do even if they did. In those proverbial terms, we now have a scenario that includes lots of constantly changing haystacks and the unenviable job of trying to find potential needles in each and every one of them. What makes things even worse for us is that these needles might only be recognized as needles when we reconstruct them from the individual parts found in one haystack with parts found in another. And if that weren't enough, we have to be watching constantly as these needles, or parts of needles, could arrive at any moment. In terms of technology, imagine a single invalid sign-on attempt occurred on just one of your servers. It would almost definitely be deemed as no big deal. It likely happens all the time, all day long. But what if that invalid sign-on were to happen across each of the servers, one after another in quick succession? If I'm an admin that's responsible for monitoring only my own server, I might not notice that what was happening to me was in fact not really a profile negotiation, but is actually part of a much bigger issue. It's important that we gather event data from all compatible devices and analyze all of it, looking for messages and patterns that could be recognized as being important. As we add more and more and more servers into that data center, this type of cross-platform monitoring has become a critical activity. These servers are likely to be running perhaps different operating systems and may be located in different parts of the world. And the security team must have automation in order to help them with this burdensome task, otherwise they're going to miss things. Remember, it's not just about seeing that something has happened, it's also about seeing it quickly enough to be able to act before the situation becomes dire. One of the many popular automation technologies is called a SIEM. Now, there's several flavors of the term, and each has functionality nuances, but they all have the same basic premise of informing us when things are happening that security people should know about. This SIEM allows the overworked and perhaps understaffed security team to see what red flags are happening across their entire enterprise landscape so that they can focus their valuable, probably limited time and attention on the most critical issues first without wasting their times on things that are not so important. One of the processes includes analytical reporting. Now, the benefit here is that it gives us the ability to see events after they occur. It's often best suited for non-time sensitive events and configuration settings. The common complaints around this technology is that the OS functionality with IBM I is limited to, for the most part, extract and query. You can't easily correlate events across different servers. So again, you have to look at each particular frame or LPAR in its own instance and not really see if things are cascading across the landscape. It's not real-time analytics. Chances are you're going to look at a report maybe at the end of the day, possibly the end of the week, or maybe the day before the auditor comes in, only to discover things have been happening the entire time. With a SIEM, you get the benefit of immediate notification of critical events. You also get visibility to events from multiple sources. The SIEM becomes kind of the hub, and all of your devices are at the end of a spoke. Common complaints around SIEMs are that the security team that perhaps are monitoring the SIEM are not that knowledgeable about IBMI. It can be hard to implement. It can be a significant financial investment, and different sources may present different data in different formats. And for the most part, many of these SIEMs are not integrated with IBMI, and they don't actually speak the I language. So we're not completely out of the woods. So let's talk about a confusion and a unique challenge for IBMI, and then we'll roll into a solution. This is an AIX log. Talk about a nightmare. These logs are impossible to understand if you're not an expert or arguably a robot. And even if you could understand them, the volume realistically is going to be really unmanageable. You could argue that Windows is perhaps a little bit prettier. It does parse it out, but the irony is this is still pretty cryptic, despite being considered the friendly view of the data. I'd hate to see the unfriendly view. IBMI is a little more organized, although again, the volume of events could number in the hundreds or even thousands per second, and that's not something a human really can deal with. Each log entry has a payload that tells the reader probably more than they want to know. In this case, we have a command string that is indicating that a user issued a command. It doesn't show it on this screen, but information would show what command that they ran. These log entries can be extracted out to a database file, so they can be searched and sorted, but the volume of mundane events is probably still unmanageable and really makes it tough to determine what is truly important to you. The other thing we have to realize is that the focus of the QAud journal is to monitor native activities, more green screen centric activities by our users. There is an entire category of events that are missing from this, and that's a huge problem. I've listed it here as PC activities, but it's really activities against the IBMI that were initiated from the PC side of the house. This may include file transfers through FTP. It could be database connections through ODBC or JDBC, or commands being issued through the remote command server. All of these are incredibly important to know when they're happening, especially based on the fact that most violations do occur from the PC side. We have pretty good control of our users through the green screen world, and so these are the interfaces that tend to be attacked the most, and yet are least visible to our auditing function. While outside of the scope of our conversation today, I do recommend, if you do not have exit programs currently in place on those services, to start augmenting the log with additional information, that is an absolutely critical conversation to be had. We're able to fulfill that function through a tool called Powertech Exit Point Manager, previously known as Network Security. So if you have that tool, you are well positioned and have a much more 360-degree view of the actions of your users flowing into that audit journal world. Once the events are there, whether you choose to augment or not, you have a choice as to whether you're going to report or alert off of the events that are being logged. So let's talk about what we do with those events through a solution within the HelpSystems portfolio. We actually have two plays here, depending on whether your desire is to report or whether you do want more of that real-time function. We're going to focus on the alerting, but if reporting is desired, then Powertech Compliance Monitor is a great answer. It's a browser-based reporting tool, highly scalable, regardless of whether you have one partition or 50, and it gives you information about your system configuration as well as visibility into those all-important audit journal events. Let's focus today on alerting, however, which is going to introduce a tool called the SIEM Agent for IBM, which is focused exclusively on the events that are happening on the machine. One of the pain points, or arguably the biggest pain point for most IBM shops when it comes to this, is that IBM's log, while extremely beneficial and robust, is logged in a proprietary language. The IBM Audit Journal is not an open interface that most SIMs or other technologies even understand. So the purpose of the SIEM agent is actually to act as a real-time translator. It takes that proprietary log entry and it puts it into something that is much more universally understood. This is often referred to as syslog. And there are flavors of that we can handle, but in a generality, that syslog function is a great way to go. Now, the SIEM agent has the ability to read information from multiple sources. The audit journal is arguably one of the most important, but we also have integration with other Powertech security solutions. We can also pull from message queues and database journals. So all of these input sources can be monitored by the SIEM agent, and when an important event occurs, it can be translated into the appropriate output. The syslog is probably the most common use of this tool. That's the real-time feed into an enterprise level SIM. But we can also send alerts to IBM message queues, and we can also build a log file within the integrated file system. So if you don't have a SIM today, all is not lost. There are other things we can do in order to give you that real-time visibility. The benefit of the SIEM agent in its current form is that it is incredibly flexible, which gives us the capability of being able to throttle and manage that event payload all the way back at the source. We start by parsing that information. Again, think of the IBM Audit Journal as a big flat file. The data that is stored within that is just a mass of data. It's important that it has to be parsed out. Now, you can parse this data based on custom structure, but in the case of the Audit Journal, we've already pre-configured all of that. So you don't have to know the breakdown of a CD entry or an AF entry. We've already done all of that lifting, and therefore those fields can be interrogated, they can be passed through, or they can be included in a message alert. If you're doing this from a database journal, you will need to parse out your database structure so that you know that the customer number, for example, starts in position 5 and goes for a length of 10. Once it is broken down, whether by us or by yourself, then you can evaluate that data through a very powerful rules engine. This allows you to designate Boolean type logic rules so that you can decide based on the data whether you are going to send or withhold the data, whether you're going to set a particular severity, or whether you want a piece of data included or excluded from the payload. Being able to do this now allows us to segregate the data between what's important and what is just general information. We also take care of transmitting that information. The event data that is generated can be sent securely to multiple concurrent outputs, and that can happen possibly based on event data. So, for example, if somebody creates an object on your system, that's probably a normal action, and you would just send it to perhaps the enterprise SIM for centralized logging. If somebody deletes an object, maybe that's a more rare event, and you not only want that to go to the enterprise SIM, but you also want it to go to a message queue so the application administrator can be made aware. And so based on the fact that the event type is different, we can send to different outputs, but we can also do it based on the data. Maybe the object is created in a production library versus a non-production library. Same type of event, but has a different library name within the data, and we can evaluate that and then transmit differently. An example of this may be a failed sign-on attempt. For most of us, this happens all day, every day. And we see users failing to sign in. Maybe Monday morning they come in and they've had a great weekend. They don't really pay attention and they start logging these invalid sign-on attempts. They fat finger it once or twice. Looks like Bob really was on a roll here, forgot that he changed it on Friday before he went home, and he did it 3 times. But eventually they get in. And so these events are very typical. Yes, they're important, but it's not a make or break. Then QSEC offer fails to sign in, but you're the security officer and it wasn't you. It's the same event type, but this is deemed a much more critical activity. The security officer profile is something that should be reserved for system functions. And when somebody tries to sign in, that's often a huge red flag that something's happening that you need to investigate. The beauty of this flexibility within SIEM Agent is that even though all of these events are password failures, PW events, we can actually interrogate the username, see that it's QSEC offer, and actually either change the message text to have exclamation points, we can increase the severity, or maybe, as I stated earlier, we can send it to multiple outputs instead of just the normal one. Now, SIEM Agent, as its name suggests, is designed to speak to a SIEM. However, I know that a lot of you probably don't have a SIEM in your environment, which is why we built the log and the message queue function there. However, if you do have a SIEM, or if you're in the market for a SIEM, then that is going to really open up the full power of SIEM Agent. If you're interested in a SIEM, maybe you don't have one today, then HelpSystems does have a great solution for this. It's called Event Manager. Event Manager is actually designed as a multi-platform solution. So it's not just for IBM I, although with SIEM Agent paired, it does of course have that capability. We can take data from disparate data sources, we can translate it, we can normalize it, we can enrich the data, and provide the security team with real-time insight as to what's happening across the entire enterprise. We can streamline the incident response, give you that forensic capability, and provide the comprehensive audit function that the auditors demand that you have. But if you already have an existing SIEM, and some of you probably do, then there is a question here. Are you proposing HelpSystems that I replace that SIEM? Well, for some of our customers, that's actually occurred. They were dealing with a SIEM that perhaps was bigger than they needed it to be, or was cost prohibitive. Maybe they were charged based on the volume of events, and adding IBM I into the mix was very expensive. In this instance, then, we do have the option of replacing that existing SIEM with Event Manager. And because Event Manager can handle devices across the network beyond just the power system running IBM I, then that is definitely a viable action. If you're perfectly happy with your SIEM and you love the solution, then I respect that entirely. The question then becomes, do you want to feed the data exclusively to that? I've listed it here as augment. One of the common conversations that we're starting to have is that customers do value that they have a platform-specific SIEM at their disposal. In this instance, because SIEM Agent is capable of sending to multiple outputs concurrently, this is actually a very viable way to go. If you're running a big tool like, well, I won't name it just because somebody will be offended, but you guys know the names of the SIEMs you're running, and we can send events to that absolutely perfectly fine. But if the case of an IBM I event comes along, then not only do we want it to go to the enterprise SIEM, but we also want to go perhaps to Event Manager because it's now being used as an IBM I-centric SIEM. This gives the local IBM I administrators a hands-on view of their system without losing control by sending it only and exclusively to the enterprise SIEM, which could be staffed by outsourcers or people that are not as familiar with the platform. So this way we get the best of both worlds. We're enhancing the capability of our local IBM I admins, but we're still getting the benefit of cross-system checking and augmenting the data into an environment that can be centrally archived, etc. So one of the things that I would offer is that it's time for an IBM I risk exam or a health check. If you've never done one of these activities, this is something that HelpSystems can perform for you, and it doesn't cost you anything. It typically only takes about 60 seconds to run it against your IBM I server, and it will look for information about your system configuration, including how your auditing is set up. It also has a section about the exit program. So if you're not sure if your FTP or your ODBC connections are exposed, as I mentioned earlier, then this will actually give you confirmation of that. The beauty of this security scan is, as I said, it's quick and it's free, but it also is accompanied by somebody who can explain the findings to you if you would like that. We'll sit down with you. Typically takes about 45 minutes to an hour, where you can ask all the security questions you like, but that person will explain the findings to you in a no obligation type stance and leave you with a much better understanding of your state of security than you had going in. And the document that comes out of this is about 14, 15 pages, and it is all colors and graphs, so it's great to hand to an executive if you're looking for sponsorship, but it's yours to keep, so you actually end with a tangible document. And you can request that free of charge from HelpSystems.com. Now, if you've joined this session and you weren't familiar with HelpSystems and our investment in security, I want to assure you that this is an area of expertise that we take great pride in, both from the provision of security software and a whole portfolio of security solutions designed to address these types of security challenges, partnered with a team of very knowledgeable security staff that can help you not only with our software, but also with bolstering the infrastructure of your IBM security. If you're thinking to yourself, but my IBM already is secure, or it has security built in. Yes and no. It does have a lot of capability there, but most of it is not turned on by default. So it takes somebody with knowledge to can correctly configure it. And that's what this team does. As part of that investment, we are a member of the PCI Security Standards Council. We're also authorized to issue continuing professional education credits for security education, which is just, I guess, a great way of saying that we educate the auditors. And lastly, it is part of a very expansive portfolio of enterprise-grade security offerings, meaning that while we have really started life in the IBM security world, we have rapidly grown and expanded that environment through both organic growth and an entire slew of security acquisitions over the last 6 or 7 years that have positioned us really as a growing household name in the enterprise security space. So regardless of your platform, regardless of your security pain point, there is probably a HelpSystems component that would be beneficial to you. I want to thank you for joining me today. If you are interested in doing further reading on IBM security, go out to HelpSystems.com and you can access demonstration videos, you can pull trial downloads, there are data sheets on our products, technical guides and articles, and of course, many success stories. If you're interested in accessing that free IBM security scan, you can reach out to us or you can sign up through an online web form to do that. So with that ends my presentation for today. I appreciate it, you joining me here today. I look forward to speaking to you again on a future session. And remember, go out, turn that auditing function on, and get that data collected. Even if you do nothing with the solution at this stage, having that data is the most critical first step in ensuring you have real-time visibility to help defend you against those security cyber attacks. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.